Well, hi everyone. We're here in Wrangell, Alaska, and it's time to finally get to this tech talk that I've promised several people about SeaVenture's electrical system. Before we start this, just wanted to welcome everybody. If you haven't watched our channel before, thanks for watching. We have a lot of fun doing it and sharing our cruising and exploring adventures with everyone. The idea behind the channel, besides just to have fun, is to try to, inspire people to pursue their passions and do whatever it is they want to do. For us, it's trawlering and cruising and traveling by our boat, SeaVenture. And apart from our regular cruising videos, this is going to be another tech talk about our electrical upgrade we went through earlier this year. Now, before we start talking about it, I'm going to go over kind of what we had before, what we switched to, and the differences. But we should first cover some reality to this project. Everything that we tore out and replaced worked exactly as designed. Every switch worked, every part worked, nothing was broken, nothing was malfunctioning. Everything was just fine, and we could have continued on just the way it was. But we wanted to make things a little more comfortable. And at the end of the day, it's really hard to come up with any additional reason besides that for this pretty significant upgrade and changes we made to the boat. The things we wanted to change or improve upon was that with the old electrical system, our heating and air conditioning on the boat required the generator to operate. We needed to run the generator a couple of times a day to keep the batteries charged up, to run what we wanted to run. We are a power boat and kind of power hungry, and we really didn't want to change that. As I've said before in other videos, Rosie has this kind of thing about, her little motto, camping is not a lifestyle choice I'm making here by living aboard a boat. So we're not going to give up anything. We're going to take the steps as best we can not to have to do so. So while under the old electrical system, we could run, if the batteries were not too discharged, you could run the coffee maker, a toaster, a microwave, or a hairdryer, let's say, as long as the batteries weren't too discharged. We wanted to change that, where you could always run those things. In fact, you could even run all four of them at once if you wanted. Weren't sure that was possible when we started kind of investigating and going through this process, but that was part of the goal. We just wanted to make it more comfortable. We wanted so we could go at least 24 hours at anchor without running the generator, something that's kind of hard to accomplish in a power boat, in a trawler, due to the power consumption. And so those were some of the kind of background motivating reasons that we wanted to make some changes to our electrical system. So first we're going to go over what we had before. And to do this, I actually drew a chart. So let's go to the chart and take a look. All right, here's the chart I've drawn, and we're going to go over it in detail here in a moment. Keep in mind, I am no artist nor marine electrician. This is just, to the best of my ability, what my understanding. And so please keep that thought in mind and be kind, okay? All right, let's take a look. We had our shore power, 50 amp, 240 volt input required, or the generator, also generating 50 amp, 240 volt. We have a 16 kilowatt Northern Lights generator. Those two fed into our inverter. An inverter does two things. One is our inverter took 120 volts up to 3,000 watts from the batteries to create 120 volt power on the boat when you're not plugged in. When you were plugged in, it was a 120 amp battery charger. So shore power or generator, either one, teeing in to a 120 volt, 3,000 watt inverter. From our inverter, several things happened. if we were connected to shore power, it charged the batteries. If we were not connected to shore power, it drew power from the batteries for the boat. Our batteries were 8 lead-acid batteries, totaling 800 amp hours capacity. Total weight of those batteries, by the way, was 1,036 pounds. So before the inverter, you can see I put a T in up here, because some things did not work on the inverter. They required shore power or generator. Those teed off of here, went over to the electrical panel, and created 240 volt loads, which was the heaters, air conditioning units, the water heater, and our washer and dryer. So those things required a generator or shore power to operate. From the inverter, we could also come over and create our 120 volt loads on the boat when we were cruising. From the lead acid batteries, we could supply our 12 volt loads. All making sense, hopefully. So we've got 12 volt loads from the batteries when we're cruising, 120 volt loads from the inverter, and if we wanted any 240 volt loads, it required the generator to be running when we were cruising. Now the batteries could also be charged by our 2 engines. So our port engine and start engine. And those engines were started by an 8D lead acid battery. And I want to talk about this a little bit. Our engines were equipped with 65 amp alternators. But those 65 amps really required 2,000 RPM. In reality, we cruise at 1,500 RPM and they produce about 45 amps. Now, one of the engines had a charge isolator, so some of the charge went to the house batteries, this 8 lead acid batteries, and some went back to the start battery that started the 2 engines. But let's talk about how alternators work. They have a regulator, and our old ones had regulators built into them. Alternators decide for themselves when a battery needs charging based on the voltage in the battery. Well, what happens when you have 2 engines is that if we start up this engine first, it starts charging the batteries. Then you start this engine, and this alternator says, well, you know, we got enough voltage there, we don't really need to be charging. So the end result is you only tend to charge with one alternator at a time, not both combined. And at 1,500 RPMs, our 65 amp alternators really only produce about 45 amps. So 45 amps tended to be the maximum amount of charging to recharge our 800 amp batteries. This is the system that we had before. So next, let's take a look at what lead acid batteries and 800 amp hour capacity means, because I think it's important to try to understand. We have 800 amp hours of lead acid battery capacity, but that doesn't really mean that. Surprise, surprise. Lead acid batteries, you can only discharge to about 50%. If you go below 50%, you start substantially reducing the lifespan. So one of those golden boating rules is never discharge your batteries below about 50%. That's at the 400 amp hour rate. So that cuts your battery capacity effectively from 800 to 400, but we're not done cutting yet. When you charge lead acid batteries, they charge up to about 80%. And then the charging rate has to drop way off. And battery chargers understand this, and they start going through absorption and float charging, because the last 20% has to be done slower. In fact, it has to be slow enough that it becomes ineffective to use that capacity because of how much generator time is required to run. So really, from about 50 to 80% of the battery capacity, we're going to call useful. In a boat, you tend to charge it up to about 80%, discharge it to 50. Charge it up to 80, discharge it to 50. That's actually, of the 800 amp hours, 240, what I'm going to call working amp hours. Now, Sea Venture consumes on average about 20 amps per hour at anchor. I know, our sailing friends will all just gag at that. But you know, we're not camping. We've got 2 refrigerators and 2 freezers, and we're going to stay comfortable, and it is what it is. At 240 working amp hours, that's only 12 hours between charges. So every 12 hours the generator needs to run. We know from the other rate that our inverter charger charges at the rate of 120 amps per hour. So you could add more battery chargers, but it's not effective. Lead acid batteries are also limited at the rate they can charge. So every 12 hours, the generator's got to run about 2 hours. Every 24 hours, the generator has to run 4 hours. So 4 hours a day, but at least twice a day to maintain our batteries and stay in this 50 to 80% range. Everyone sitting down in the engine room of C-Venture. As we begin this electrical project, I just wanted to give you a quick review of what we've got in place now, so it'll make sense as we work through the transitions of what we have. So here in the engine room, if you haven't seen our engine room before, feel free to watch the engine room tour video. It seems to be a really popular one. So some of the changes we're making. We've got our standard alternators right here on each engine, on the port and starboard engine. We've got our solar panel controller, the commander from Renergy. That's actually going to stay in place with some wiring changes. Then here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 house batteries, the lead acid batteries. And in that box is our 1 engine start battery. So this gives us kind of an overview of what we've got at the moment that we're going to start changing to make our big upgrade. Whew, that's better sound-wise, huh? That's the heating system just turned off, the cruise airs over there. So let's get started on this big project. So I've got another chart, and as you're going to see, it's a little more complicated. So let's zoom in and look at it part by part. Okay, to start, shore power. Now we've got 50 amp 240 volt like we had before, or 30 amp 120 volt. We don't care. We can plug into two different kinds, the two most common kinds of power we'll find at any dock, anywhere. So there we go. So that gives us that ability. Now we go to an amperage voltage selector switch that's been added, because we do have to tell the system, are we plugging into 50 amp 240 volt or are we plugging into 30 amp 120 volt? After the selector switch, we're going to what's called an isolation transformer. We still have our generator, no change there, and we come down. Now here we're going to change where we went before into 1 inverter. Now aboard C-Venture, we go to 2 inverters. They're both identical. 120 volt, 3000 watt, plus 120 amp chargers. We'll go over in a little bit now why there's 2 inverters. So, and you remember before we had a leg off before going all the way over to the electrical panel? We still have that to provide 240 volt, what we're going to call now non-inverted loads. That is stuff that still requires either shore power or the generator to work. Before, that was the heating, air conditioning, washer, dryer, and water heater. Now it's the water heater, and without giving too much away about what you might see in some future videos, a dive compressor to fill scuba tanks. Those are the only 2 things required on the boat that require the generator or shore power to have power. Off of the 2 inverters now, before we go to the electrical system on the boat, we have what's called a load balancing transformer. Because we have 2 legs of 120 volt power from inverters, we now have the option to have 120 or 240 volt power from the batteries. But you know, in the panel, you end up wiring stuff to leg 1 and wiring stuff to leg 2. Well, what if everything you want to use is on leg 1? And how do you get these balanced? Well, we don't have to worry about that, because the power goes to a load balancing transformer that automatically moves the power around and balances the demand from each inverter to be equal. So after the load balancing transformer, we can go to the electrical panel, and we now have 240 volt inverted loads. So while cruising or at anchor, we now have heat, air conditioning, and the washer and dryer without running the generator. One of our goals. We still have our 120 volt load from the inverters. After the two inverters, they charge and provide and get power from now 4 lithium ion batteries. The same 800 hour capacity, but it's not really the same, and we'll go over another chart for these batteries. Total weight, by the way, instead of 1,036 pounds is 160 pounds. We've added into here now 600 watts of solar panels. I suppose I got to move the camera so you can see that. 600 watts of solar panels to a solar charge controller feeding directly into the lithium ion batteries or a charger as well. Now that's the top half. Let's go on down and take a look at the bottom half. So here's our lithium ion batteries again. If we go down here now, we've got a port engine and a starboard engine. Those now have 100 amp Balmar alternators on each one. They also, instead of one start battery, now have each their own 8D AMG start batteries, one for each engine. Remember we talked about how in the old system, how the alternators kind of compete with each other and only one works at a time for the most part? We've solved that problem. With the Balmar, we've gone to external regulators to control the amperage from them, and then gone into what's called a Balmar center fielder. The center fielder controls the amperage draw from these batteries, from these alternators. As a result, they can both operate at full capacity. Now the 100 amps is really at 2000 RPM, but remember we only cruise at 1500 RPM. But at 1500 RPM, these produce 85 amps apiece. Not just the 45 amps we were getting before. Now with 85 amps apiece and the center fielder not having them compete with each other, controlling that, we have 170 amps of total charging capacity going into the lithium batteries. One of the advantages of lithium batteries, whatever you put into them, they can accept the charge, almost. Unlike a lead acid battery that has a limited charging capacity, lithium ion batteries do not have nearly that limitation. So that's going to be the basic system. Now, I've got to add a few things in here, a few thoughts. I've actually way oversimplified this diagram. I've left off the charging loops that charge these batteries. These batteries do get charged. You just don't see all the wiring that's related to that here. I've left off battery switches and transfer switches. While this says starboard start engine battery, this is port engine start battery, this is lithium house batteries. In fact, we can make any one of these in any location with a series of switches that are on board the boat. Also, associated with the lithium ion batteries is a variety of controllers and safety monitors and relays that manage charge capacity, temperature, all kinds of stuff. And they're all intertwined in this area in the system. And I've left those off of this diagram because frankly it's over my head and there's only so much room on this piece of paper. So this is basically now SeaVenture's new electrical system. So what it allows us to have heat, air conditioning in the washer and dryer while we're cruising. It allows us to be at anchor longer and run the generator less. So let's look at a chart associated with lithium ion batteries like we did the lead acid batteries. So here's our lithium ion battery little chart I made. Again, 100% is 800 amp hours. Here I've marked off 20%, which is 160 amp hours. Because unlike our lead acid batteries that you don't want to discharge below 50%, lithium ion batteries are just fine to discharge to 20%. You can actually go lower, but we'll use 20% as our measurement for what we're doing here. So we're still consuming about 20 amps at anchor. But now we have 640 working amps out of the same 800 amp hours. At 20 amps per hour, that means we can now go 32 hours between charges with the generator. And remember now that we have two inverters charging at 120 amps, not just one. So we charge at twice the rate, 240 amps per hour. So every 32 hours now, because we can go 32 hours without running the generator, we need to run the generator 2.6 hours to bring it all the way up to 100%. That's 2 hours a day, about, or every 24 hours, without the solar panels. With the solar panels, our generator time so far has averaged about 1 hour a day. So that's the big difference in 800 amp hours of lithium ion batteries versus 800 hours of lead acid batteries and the impact on our daily living at Anchor. And half of our house battery bank is gone. And now installed is this modern miracle, which is an isolation transformer. Our shore power goes into this incredibly heavy little unit, and through a series of, and I'm no electrician, electromagnets, our power goes from there and to the boat without actually touching. Through the magnets the power transmits. So it protects the boat from errant shore power issues, and also protects shore power from errant boat issues. Our electrical project continues. I just thought I'd show you a little update as we're partway through. One of the new Balmar 100 amp alternators is on the starboard engine and getting ready to get hooked up. I think the port engine is in process, so that's just part of the project. As you may recall, there's our old house batteries, or half of our old house batteries we're still working on, but we have a new wall installed with our two 120 volt 3000 watt 120 amp chargers, our Vitron inverter chargers. So the covers are off now as they're continuing the wiring process for those. We have all those house batteries that went away that have been replaced by these 4 lithium batteries that have the paperwork on top. They're not hooked up to the house system yet, just to each other, but they're getting there. So that's the work so far. And I suppose I should show you our main electrical panel, and the reason I'm showing that, and I didn't show it in the first video, is because I can't help myself and we have a little job creep. Heritage Electric, as part of the process now, is going to completely replace and rewire our main electrical panel, which will get all our breakers lined up and looking good, I think. So that's the project so far, and I'll keep you updated as we move along. Now, let's go to the engine room with our new system chart and actually identify and look at all these items that have now been installed in the engine room. All right, in the engine room, here was our diagram, remember, of the new system. Now we'll let the diagram go, and let's take an engine room tour of the SeaVenture's new electrical system. We're going to start with, remember we had our shore power to our voltage on-off switch. This selector switch. So this is the final selector switch where we choose 240 50 amp or 120 30 amp. The switch is set up so you can only have one of these breakers on at a time. So that was the first item in the process. The second item was the isolation transformer. And I'm really glad that in the video clip of the job partway done, you got to see the isolation transformer, because it's buried now behind a partial new wall and the batteries. And so we'll get a glimpse of it in a little bit, but it's not as easy to show. So here's the isolation transformer today. Here's the 2 Vitron energy inverters and battery chargers. And we did go with all Vitron equipment. And we'll talk a little bit more about that selection in the closing. Here is the 4, actually pretty little, lithium ion batteries that produce 800 amp hours. And If you can see this wall here, it's got all kinds of stuff. Alternator regulars and center fielder that we talked about. I mentioned that we had some switches and relays and stuff like that, not on the diagram. And some of those are located there. Here's the new Vitron solar charger controller. This is the 240 volt dive compressor for filling scuba tanks on board SeaVenture. And this is the automatic control box for the dive compressor. It can start and stop automatically and do some other cool things related to filling scuba tanks. Here's the auto transformer that balances the loads between line 1 and line 2. So when we have a power demand, regardless of which line we're requesting power from, it balances that demand to each inverter equally, so that we can, if we want, draw up to the 6,000 watts of inverter power. Here is one of the 2 new Balmar 100 amp alternators. Here's job creep number 1, the new electrical panel aboard SeaVenture, where everything is organized now in new breakers and all nicely labeled for 12 volt, 120 volt, 240 volt, both inverted and non-inverted loads, main breakers, voltage and amperage meters. While we were doing the new electrical panel, Paul, the owner of Heritage Electric, was kind enough to get from us a digital copy of our new logo, and he engraved it into the panel, which was just a nice add-on from them, which we really liked. And then at the last moment, I had them add these 2 switches down here, which allow us to start the engines from the engine room. And I have to say, since they've been added, this is really the only place we've been starting the engines. I like starting the engines down here with them so I can see them and take a look at them. So job creep number 2 or 3 or whatever, I don't know. One of the things that we left as a non-inverted load that requires the generator or shore power is the water heater. And there's a couple reasons we did that. One, we did it because the water heater takes an extraordinary amount of power to heat the water. And so doing it off the batteries really didn't make sense. But more importantly, it wasn't even necessary to do it off the batteries, because instead of 2 small water heaters that tended to lose their temperature over the course of 10 or 12 hours, we have installed a new 30-gallon Torrid, their yacht series of water heater. And this guy only loses a degree or 2 per hour, and it has proven to work as advertised. So if you can recall, we need to run the generator about every 32 hours now at Anchor, and this holds 30 gallons of hot water for longer than that. So it's given us an uninterrupted hot water supply, which has been really nice. At the same time that I did the hot water heater, we took what was kind of a mess of T's and Y's that was our water supply system, and created a new water manifold for hot and cold water system and the water pump. So we can turn all the water lines off to the boat here, and made that hopefully look kind of nice. So that's the engine room tour of all the new items that we installed as part of the electrical upgrade. The final new component to show you is the new control and monitoring system located in the salon. It's broken up into 3 components. One is this top graphical, some control knobs related to it, some status lights and warning lights related to the inverters, and another battery monitor, which much of this stuff is then just repeated in an easier to read format up here. Let's take a closer look at this part. This is the new monitor. This tells us what we're collecting from shore power. Right now only 497 watts here in Wrangell. You'll notice line 1 and line 2, it tells you the amount of draw from each line, which is balanced as designed. Tells you what the battery chargers are doing. Right now they're just floating because we're 100% charged. It tells you our total AC loads between the two lines, Right now 464 watts. You'll notice they're within just a few watts of line 1 and line 2. That's our auto transformer balancing those loads exactly. It tells us that our batteries are at 13.5 volts. They're 100% charged. That we're using 230 watts of DC power. And that right now we have 141 watts coming from our solar panels, even though it is the first week of October in Alaska. The little dotted lines, if you can see that, that's the way the power's going. So actually right now the solar panels are producing all of our DC power load necessary, and the shore power is providing the AC loads. These dots and lines go whichever way is the power is traveling. When the engines are running, this DC power goes to a big minus number, and you can see the power going back to the batteries and up to the AC loads. So this is the monitor. It also has a variety of programming controls that we can go to and make all types of adjustments. This secondary panel just tells us some information about what's going on with the inverters, that the main is on, that it's at float. It gives us a variety of warning lights if we have some temperature issues with the batteries, low battery overload. It tells us if the inverters are on, which they're not right now since we're hooked to shore power. And it provides this current limit dial, which is really interesting. This right now is set at 45. That means we're not going to draw more than 45 amps from shore power. If we have a load on or that exceeds 45 amps, we're okay. It won't trip a breaker on shore if that occurs, or if we're hooked up to only 30 amp power, we can dial this way down simply by turning the knob to wherever we want it to be. And if our demand exceeds 45 amps, what will happen? It will take 45 amps from the shore power, and it will take the balance of whatever we need from the batteries. It's called a power assist. And as soon as we were to drop our demand below 45 amps, it will then switch back and use the leftover power to recharge the batteries back up. So this power assist allows you to connect to different levels of power at the marina and use all the power you want. All right, this is a long enough video, so it's time to get this thing wrapped up for you. Sorry about how long it is, but I thought if you're interested, then hopefully you're interested in the actual details, and I didn't want to just gloss over a bunch of stuff. I still kind of did in a lot of areas, small areas, but it gave you a basic overview of the upgrade that we accomplished. And so far, we've had it in operation several months. It has been fantastic. It has worked great. It has done what we've wanted to do. The solar panels have performed fantastically. I just couldn't be happier with the overall upgrade and the change in the generator time, the hot water all the time, the not needing to run the generator. Really, we don't have to run the generator unless you spend 2 nights at one anchorage. And then the minimal run of the generator time has been really comfortable. And so all those things have really worked well and been really nice. It's been nice to be able to turn everything on, whether it be a hairdryer, toaster, or microwave, or all at the same time without any concern. It's nice to be able to get up in the morning and start the coffee maker without having to worry about its power draw or if there's enough voltage left in the batteries to do so. All those concerns have gone away, and that has been really nice. So, as I said at the very beginning of this video, everything we tore out worked. Worked fine, worked exactly as designed. Nothing broken, nothing really requiring an upgrade. This was all a want to make the boat more comfortable deal. And we knew what we wanted. And so we worked with Heritage Electric in Everett, and they were fantastic. The entire project took, for the most part, 2 marine electricians working 6 weeks to do this install. For parts of it, there was just 1 marine electrician, but it was a lot of hours. And we went with all Vitron Energy parts, and they're pretty expensive, frankly. We added some additional upgrades that I didn't show you initially, but I can real quick. If I do this on my phone real quick, at any time from anywhere, I can see the status of the batteries on my phone. It's also hooked up to the internet, so we can see it remotely. Even in some of the programming of the system and working out some bugs, we were able to communicate directly with Vitron in Europe. That's where they're based. And they were able to see in real time online our electrical system. And so that is all pretty cool to have this remote monitoring as well. All this, of course, costs money. At the end of the day, when all was said and done, it was about $30,000 in material cost and $20,000 in labor. So the total cost was somewhere around $50,000 for this upgrade. As I said, this wasn't necessary. It was that we wanted to do. So we didn't really enter this project, frankly, with a budget. We just knew what we wanted in the end, and that's what it ended up costing. We're fine with that, and really happy with the upgrade and with the improvements to the livability of C-Venture. So that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comment section of YouTube, or you can email me at cruisingcventure@gmail.com. Otherwise, until the next video, see ya. Bye-bye.